Good morning. On behalf of the Encompas team here, we are really pleased to be returning today to our Mindset Matters series after taking a break over the summer. During that time, we did also reflect on the format of these sessions, which have been done monthly up until this point. And we decided that going forward, we will move these to quarterly seminars. And so stay tuned for the information on the next seminar, which will take place on Wednesday, December 6th at 10 a.m. All right, today we are pleased to have Scott Jones with us. Scott is a very recently retired police officer. He's been with the Edmonton Police for 30 years. And in fact, when we started talking with Scott back at the end of spring, early summer, Scott was still active on the police force at that point in time. And so we're really looking forward to catching up with Scott today. I actually heard of Scott a couple of years ago, funny enough, but only recently connected the dots that this was the same person. Scott was actually referenced by Françoise Mathieu, who is a specialist in trauma-exposed work and in the development of training and resources for military and public safety personnel. And Françoise and I were in discussions to acquire some of her resources for the Encompas portal, which we did do. And in those discussions about this important work, she talked about this police leader on the Edmonton police team who was very forward-thinking in this area of mental health for first responders. And so here we are today, really pleased to have you with us, Scott, to hear about your career in policing and your well-being story and your thoughts really around how and why the two need to go hand in hand. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping points, and I'll turn it over to you, Scott. We have purposely disabled cameras and microphones so that everyone can participate anonymously. We are recording the presentation and we'll host it on the Encompas site to enable access for those who may have missed it or wish to watch it again. And we do get lots of rewatches there. If you have any questions or comments, Scott would love to hear those. Please submit them through the Q&A feature. So those questions will then come only to Scott and the Encompas team. We'll read them out to ensure anonymity, and Scott will keep an eye on that for you. Okay, so if you don't have any questions or specific comments, but you want to show Scott that you're out there and what he's saying is resonating with you, just type in AAA for awesome or OOO for outstanding, and we'll let Scott know about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Just so you know, I'm getting feedback from I'm hearing my own voice. Oh, there, it's good now. It was bouncing around in my head there. That'd be bad. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it. I'm very honored to be here. My goal or plan here is, this is not me giving advice or telling advice. I title these oftentimes teaching what I need to learn, because as you see, I am a work in progress. I have not got it figured out. And I offer myself as a case study. So I'm going to kind of just share, here's some modalities that have worked for me. Here's where my career was or is. I guess it ended now. I was retired on September 1st. And I think one of the biggest things that I've learned and continue to learn is there is no finish line for resilience. It's an ongoing, relentless process that we kind of need to take responsibility for, and it might be a minute here or 2 minutes here or an hour there, but it's a relentless process to make sure that we're looking after our well-being. One of the things I want to do as well is provide some tangible breath techniques. So I don't know if people listen to this when they're sitting in an office or driving. If they're driving, please don't close your eyes when we do some of the centering stuff. That would be bad. Yeah. So always an option. And I'll coach us through that once we get close through it. So my goal is to show, here's my career path over the course of the 30 years. Here's a couple of key points that landed in my nervous system in a certain way. Here's my corresponding fitness/wellness routine that kind of has really taken a unique and unanticipated track, I guess, or tact. One thing I do want to say, so I'll refer to my nervous system and I'll talk about the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. So that's our fight, flight, freeze. So that's when we're kind of in more of an engaged state, maybe even hyper arousal potentially, or our parasympathetic system. which is our rest and digest system. That kind of brings our heart rate down, breathing down, blood pressure down. And I'll talk about the window of tolerance, which is a Dr. Dan Segal. I think that's how you say his name. And how do we widen that window of tolerance, with the top being our hyper arousal if we go over top of it, the bottom being that hypo arousal if we go below it. And as I talk here, my nervous system is more likely into the hyper arousal. My nervous system really, really enjoys conflict, and it has been successful in my life thus far, whether it's policing or life. So it's done what it's supposed to do. But now if I get hyper aroused, it ends up being a maladaptive thing. It's not doing me any good to be in that kind of agitated fight or flight freeze state. So I started policing in 1993. So probably a whole bunch of people here were not even born then. So that's cool. I started in patrol, like everybody does, in the north end of Edmonton. Edmonton, for those who don't know, our agency has about 1,800 sworn officers and then about 750 civilian folks. And the population of Edmonton now is at about 1 million people, or just shy of. So it's a big city with big city problems. So I spent my first 5 years in patrol in North Edmonton, very busy, high violence, high crime area when I started. From there, I went to downtown patrol just for a change of scenery. And then I walked a beat for 3 years. So kind of got out of the car, really learned how to talk to people of kind of all ages and backgrounds and all that. From there, I had one of my career goals achieved, where I went to recruit training unit, where I taught control tactics, officer safety, firearms. And we had started what was called guided imagery, where we would have a script that we would read, and then there would be a guided imagery part about, let's say, OC spray day, when the recruits are going to be sprayed. And the reason I'm kind of focusing on that, because later on when I talk about teaching yoga, it was a weird universe putting where I'm supposed to be, where teaching control tactics and guided imagery is very similar to teaching yoga techniques and meditation, mindfulness, breathing. So it was kind of a weird parallel. From training section, I went back to patrol for a little bit in the south end of Edmonton. And then I got an opportunity to go into professional standards. So I was in internal affairs, what it was called back then, investigating police officers. So a very, again, high conflict, very high volume area. And I'm focusing on that because I think that's the start of kind of the lighting the fuse of what ended up being a burnout. And that's sometimes an overused term, but I'll just stick with that. And if somebody wants more specificity about that, I'm sure I'll clear it up here shortly. So I go into internal affairs or professional standards. From there, I become a patrol sergeant. Again, career goal that I really, really enjoyed in downtown division, running a squad of about 10 to 12 folks. And for those who are bosses of people, you know that you are their boss and their mom and their dad and their priest and their all the things, and brother, sister, all that. And you deal with all the things that come with that. Very rewarding job, but again, very busy, high violence area. From there, another career goal was achieved, where I got to be a homicide detective, and I spent 4.5 years in homicide. So again, a high energy output, very meaningful work, but very difficult for all the reasons. One being obviously the subject matter, B being the not at all healthy call out on call all the time. My files had travel, so I went all across the country a number of times. It was just the nature of the files that I had. So again, that's kind of an area that's starting to impact my system, and I didn't even know it at the time. I also was involved with the Victims of Homicide Support Society while I was in homicide. So they are a group that deals with the families of victims and really helps those families through in their journey of healing. So I would go there for their monthly meetings, my brother and I, and again, just doing what you can to help people through that process. At the same time, corresponding to that, I was on the Edmonton Police Association for 6 years. Had ended prior to homicide. I was also a crisis negotiator prior to homicide. I did that in 2 different stints, before homicide and then after. From homicide, I got an opportunity to be the staff sergeant in charge of child protection section, so our child abuse unit in the Zebra Center, a multidisciplinary team dealing with tremendous high harm files and such a tremendous volume and very difficult subject matter as well. From there, I was fortunate to get an opportunity, and I got promoted into inspector rank, and I was promoted into human resources. I had exactly 0 experience in human resources, so the learning curve was like climbing a mountain the other direction. The only experience I kind of had was being on the police association. At least I had been there when some of the sections in the agreement had been written, so I knew the spirit in which that had taken place. So when you're kind of looking at a position or whatever, I could put those together. But again, another very high conflict, high energy output, where as the inspector in there, if I make a decision, and I had to all the time, if I pick A, B hates me. If I pick B, A hates me. It was a really tough spot. So I'm going to park there for a second, because that is kind of where I've unwittingly cooked myself or burnt out or whatever. So I'm going to park HR for a moment. Going back to even when I started, I was really good about fitness for the sake of fitness. I wasn't so much thinking it from any mental health. Like, I knew it made me feel better, but there was kind of a surface level to it. So I lifted weights, and I took creatine, and I lifted heavy things, and I ran a bit, and I've kind of run once a week for 20 some years. So that was kind of always part of my routine. And about 12 years ago, I hurt my back. So my wife, who had been doing yoga for 10 years already, cajoled me into getting into a yoga space for no other reason than I needed to move better. So I went to my first class, and I'm the only guy in there, and I'm a bigger dude that does not fit into yoga spaces, and neither does this face. So I'm sitting there doing my thing, and the guy is kind of doing twists or whatever. And I don't even know it, but I'm starting to swear. My wife's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I don't know. I'm just doing yoga." She's like, "No, you're swearing." I'm like, "Well, my knee clicked." So I didn't even know I was swearing. I was not fitting in the space, but that kind of started a path where basically once a week for the last 12 years, I've done yoga. So no more than that. It's not a 5 day a week thing. I don't want to do anything 5 days a week, but that again, made me move better. Such that 6 months later, I'm in the car and I'm driving, and I go to look out the back window, and I turn, and I can actually see out the back window. And I said to my wife, I'm like, "Holy shit, I can see out the back window." She's like, what do you mean it's not dirty?" Like, no, I can actually turn my body and look out the back window. So it made a huge difference just in my overall mobility, which again starts to kind of think, well, okay, maybe there's something else that I could be doing. And I was still doing the weights, etc. About 7 or 8 years ago, I read a book called What Doesn't Kill Us by Scott Carney, and it detailed Wim Hof and a certain breathing technique that was very sympathetic system dominant. It's holotropic breathing, like it's a yogic breathing technique, and cold exposure. So I started doing cold exposure around then, and getting into a cold tub, and that really resonated with me as well. I still do that 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes 4. I have a trough in my backyard, and I get into the trough a couple, 3 times a week. Sit in there for a minute and a half, and it's awful every single time, but it really made a difference in me starting to be able to regulate myself and using the breath to do so. About 3 years ago or so, I started doing meditation. It was actually probably more like 4 years ago now. I tried Headspace app. I didn't like that one. I tried a few different ones, and I landed on Waking Up. It's Sam Harris, and Waking Up I like his kind of PowerPoint voice. Like, he's got a dry tone to him. Plus, the app has kind of expanded so much that it actually has an intro course on it, on how to do it. And people are like, "Well, I can't meditate." I'm like, I understand that. Nobody really can. And it's not about sitting there and being perfectly silent for 10 minutes. And I did it this morning because I woke up kind of anxious today. Laying there, and then as your mind drifts off into the past or the future, all is just noticing that, and then walking it back home to where you are. And doing that in 10 minutes or 20 minutes, maybe 5,000 times, maybe 50 times. And maybe you might get 30 or 40 seconds of quiet or peace or stillness, or maybe it's 2 seconds. That's it. The practice is noticing when you're kind of in the thought forest and walking yourself back from that thought forest. So people oftentimes, and I still do the same thing, "Well, I can't meditate, I can't sit still." I understand that none of us can, and that's why it's called a practice, because it very much is a practice. So that is also an ongoing thing for me. Then about 3 years ago, my wife had been kind of on me about being a yoga teacher, which really had not interested me at that early on. But I thought, well, I guess maybe I'll give it a try. So in 2020, I entered into yoga teacher training. Absolutely remarkable, transformative experience. I was in class with 11 ladies from age about 25 to 65. They were remarkable human beings. It was during the pandemic, so sometimes we were in person, sometimes we were online, and it was over the course of 9 months, a 200-hour program. But I knew once I was in there that I wanted to go down a couple different tracks. One being trauma-informed practice. So how do I, in my teaching, make a space that folks can feel safe? Because I can't just tell you, "Jen, this is safe. This is a safe space for you." Your nervous system has to know whether it is or isn't. Yeah. So I've taken a whole bunch of extra courses on that. I've read all the books that I can possibly get a hold of. And then breath work, because I think of all the things I'm going to talk about today, breath work is probably the most impactful because it's the most accessible, and it's something you can practice at any point, at any time. You don't really need to even carve out time to do it. You can do it sitting in the front of the computer, at work, at home, wherever. And I think that has probably been the biggest impact on me. I want to just briefly tell a story. So after taking my yoga teacher training, I needed to go teach right away. Like, I knew it would be perishable. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. So I started teaching with police and social agency partners in Edmonton. Started out with like 6 or 8 people. Now we kind of get 25 people or so, and not all the same people all the time. Like, it seems to be there's a high number of folks coming. And I started teaching in an Indigenous healing lodge. So it was a place where the men were serving federal sentences for various criminal acts. And I taught in there. And again, had probably 6 or 8 of the men show up. That has since dried up, but I've since started teaching at a addiction center in Edmonton as well. It's a residential treatment center for men. My nervous system also really, really likes being in spaces with people with trauma. I think I'll call it the gift of my trauma, which I heard on a Dax Shepard podcast, where throughout my life and throughout my career, and I think why I got to be a negotiator and was pretty successful at it, and homicide, etc., is people will tell me things. Like, I think my nervous system we co-regulate, and I can bring a sense of calm if I'm calm, and their systems recognize that there is probably some similarities. And in teaching in all these spaces and being a negotiator and all that, all of us are probably way more alike than we think we are, whether we're police or a complainant in the justice system or a civilian in the justice system or whatever, nurses, educators, all of that. There's trauma in all these systems. So my nervous system enjoys being in those spaces. Just kind of a little case study. There's a guy, I won't use his real name, we'll just call him Larry, was one of the men in Stan Daniels, and he was serving a sentence for manslaughter. He was an Indigenous man. I'm about 6'1", he's about 6'4". He has long gray hair. Like, he looks like he's off of a movie. He's a remarkable dude. And I know that's a weird thing for a police officer to say. And it was a weird thing for me to kind of get over with. I'm in homicide previously, walking families through that terrible process. But then I am dealing with a guy named Larry who had done a terrible thing and knew he had done a terrible thing. But when you're having a conversation with him, he's one of the most introspective and interesting and kind people I had met. So again, it was that kind of juxtaposition in my head that really doesn't matter what Scott's opinion is. That's just what the facts were. So he comes to yoga, and he one day is very agitated. So he's breathing high up in his chest and through his mouth like that. So I'm like, "You good?" He's like, "Yeah, I had to go to City Center Mall, which is a mall downtown in Edmonton." I'm like, "I don't know what you mean." He's like, "I know what I look like, and I know I'm kind of scary. So I walk through the mall, and I make a little bit of eye contact, but not too much. And I say hi, but not too much, because I know what people see me as." And he's like, "I'd rather walk through a yard of 700 inmates than walk through City Center Mall." I'm like, "Okay." I said, "Could we go over a coffee some point and we can have a conversation about this?" Yes. So we booked coffee for a couple of weeks later. I take him to a coffee place, and he's been in jail for a significant part of his life. So he doesn't know how to make, like, doesn't know what to order, because it's just usually somebody sliding it to him. This particular place is one of those like hippie joints that I go to all the time that has like 17 types of milk and 18 types of sugar. So I'm like, "Yeah, this is cream, that's the sugar, we're good." So we go outside, sit on the patio, and he's facing the building. So, and there's the glass, and I'm sitting kind of next to him, side by side. Behind him is the parking meter that people are going to pay for parking. And somebody walks in behind him, and I watch his shoulders come up. He starts mouth breathing again, starts breathing high up into his chest. And then, so I'm like, "You good?" He's like, "Oh, bro, I don't like people behind me." I'm like, "Dude, I don't like people behind me either." Like, as a police officer, that was also part of my hypervigilance. So I'm like, "Can we just focus on the breath again?" So we just brought back to bringing the breath in and out of the nose, slowing it down, exhale a little bit longer than the inhale. And within, 45 seconds, if that, he is calm and regulated. Conversation continues. Over the next 45 minutes, he doesn't react at all to the people behind him. Like, we just keep our conversation. So I'm like, "Hey, you're doing really good. Like, there's like 10 people who went past there." He's like, "No, it's because we're in this conversation." I'm like, "Dude, that ain't it. It's because you did this with your breath work. You regulated your nervous system. That was all you. You have that power." So it was just one of those kind of lessons. And I like to share that as how powerful this stuff is. So with that, I think that's a good time that I'd like to Again, I'd like to do a little bit of, oh, I got a thumbs up. That was nice. A bit of breath practice. So what I'm going to do is we're not going to change our breath in this instance. All we're going to do is I'm going to walk us through and just being aware of what our breath is doing. And it'll take literally like a minute or two. If your eyes are closed, that's fine. If they're open, that's also fine. This is, again, finding whatever is comfortable for you. And if sitting in silence is a bit of a, I don't like to use the word trigger, but if you find that induces a bit of anxiety, then that's okay. You can also sit and just tapping your hands on your knees, tapping your hands on your shoulders, drumming your fingers. And sometimes that can kind of help dissipate that. Oftentimes in yoga, you'll have shavasana at the end, so everybody's laying still. Sometimes that's not great for people's nervous system. And it took me a long time for me to get where I could do that. Mm-hmm. Sitting and tapping and moving is all perfectly good. This is not you have to or you shall. This is finding what works best for you. So with the breath work, excuse me, all we're going to do is I'm going to ask that you just kind of sit however you are comfortably in your chair, or if you're laying down and listening to this. And again, if you're driving, please don't close your eyes. And just starting to notice your feet on the floor, noticing your seat, your back body in the chair. And if it feels okay to do so in your nervous system, allowing your eyes to close. And if you want to keep your eyes open, just keeping your gaze really soft and downcast. And without changing anything, just noticing your breath. Noticing the arrival of the inhale. Noticing the exhales that leaves. And then widening our attention out just a bit and noticing the movement in our body. So maybe that's the movement of the breath. Maybe you're noticing movement of muscles, little twitches or twinges. Maybe you notice your heartbeat. And then just returning our attention awareness back to our breath. And again, noticing an inhale as it arrives. And maybe even imagining like it's a gentle wave coming off of a lake or off the ocean. To your collarbones, which is the beach. And having that exhale recede back into the water. And letting your mind become wide open to any sensations that arise. Well, sensations can be physical or mental or spiritual or emotional. Greeting any of those sensations with a curiosity and a compassion versus a judgment or frustration. And giving yourself a moment to move from this relaxed state back to our alert and everyday level, and allowing your eyes to flutter open if you close them, taking any movements you need to do, if shoulders up or shaking or whatever works best for you. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go back. We're parked here at being a yoga teacher. I parked my career at Human Resources. And again, so I spent, oh, yeah, sorry, Louise.
I just want to say thank you for that little,
It was lovely.
Yes.
Oh, awesome.
Yes.
Wonderful. I will, I have a couple more of those to do. So, oh, got a heart too. That's good. Thank you so much. Yeah. So HR, again, 2.5 years there. Prior to that, child protection for 2.5 years. Prior to that, homicide for 4.5 years. Patrol sergeant before that for a couple. Professional standards for a couple. So kind of and I didn't even know it. And this is one of the times I come from a police family. My brother's a retired police officer now. My dad's a retired police officer. My uncle's a retired police officer. So nobody talked about what any of this was going to do for our nervous systems. Nobody even used the word nervous system. Nobody used the word trauma back then. So watching my dad retire and be all of a sudden like him and his friends, and they would think about a fatal collision from 1974, and they'd suddenly be sobbing. And they're like, I don't know where the hell this came from. I don't know what's going on. So as we're progressing through my career, I'm getting increasingly dysregulated. I'm going to keep using that terminology because I'm not broken. I'm not bad. I'm not shitty. And like, that's part of kind of changing our self-talk. And I swear a little bit, I'm doing a really good job so far of filtering myself, because I swear a ton, but I'm going to do better than that today. That's my goal as well. So I go into, from human resources, I go into major crimes. I'm the inspector in major crimes. So in charge of homicide and robbery and blah, blah, blah. And I don't really remember much about major crimes. And I had this conversation with my wife a couple months ago, where she's like, all I remember is you were really angry. So again, my nervous system is into the hyperarousal, and I also am a contrarian, and I like arguing and confrontation and picking fights, particularly with bosses like that. I have a problem with authority. So, and again, was successful at it. I got to a rank that I never even thought about doing. I didn't want to be that high rank. That wasn't the career plan. It just happened to be. So I was fortunate, but I like picking fight with bosses. And in that time, I was fighting with bosses. I adored my superintendent, so I didn't fight with her, but I fought with the deputy chief. I fought with the chief of the day. Like, I was pokey chest all the way around. The issues that I was arguing about, I think I was still right, but the manner in which I was delivering that message was over the top. Right. So I go from there, and then I'm thinking, well, I'm going to go to Northeast. I do a couple years in major crimes, a year and a half maybe. I'm going to go back where I started. I think my career's done. I don't think I want to do this anymore, but I'm going to go kind of do that full circle. I'm going to go back to Northeast. So I go there, and I'm working with the patrol folks. As everybody knows, they're just such wonderful, hardworking, amazing people who do such great work, get very little recognition for it. Police agencies always say the patrol's the backbone, and then demonstrate usually the exact opposite of that. So I'm dealing with all these young folks, and they're starting to fill my cup. Like, they're just remarkable, compassionate individuals. Like, and 99% of them are like that. But in about, I think it was February of 2021. So again, I've done all these things. I've done the cold, I've done yoga, I'm running, working out, doing all the things, breath work, teaching yoga. I think I'm on the track here. And then I'm at the lake. I have a cabin in Saskatchewan, so the province next here. And it's February, and it's beautiful, and I'm going cross-country skiing, and I feel what feels like a dark cloud settles over top of my head. And I can't describe it in any other way than I call it crackling. So it's kind of pointy and dark and smoky, and it feels awful. And it seemingly came out of nowhere, where I didn't know what was going on. So I finished my cross-country ski. It doesn't move it out. By the February of 21 till about May, I am significantly dysregulated. I am bawling my face off at home. My wife and kids are like, what the hell's going on? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what's wrong. Like, there seems to be no reason for any of it. When I say it came out of nowhere, that's what it felt like at the time. It's not true, because my system had been tapping me on the shoulder going, hey, we need to do something. Hey, we need to do something. Hey, we need to do something. Okay, we're not going to do something. Well, here's what's going to happen next. And I got that settling over. So I decided to go to therapy, and I had no preconceived notion, or I didn't have an ego about not going to therapy. Do you have a question, Louise?
Yes, if you don't mind.
No, of course.
I'm just curious if you can share. You said your system was tapping you. When you look back on it now, what were some of those indicators that you didn't see then?
Yeah, I think the fuse had been lit in all the jobs I've been doing. So I thought I was regulated, and I really wasn't. My switch for anger was really quick. Mm-hmm. I'm not my best, still not my best version of self when I'm driving. Like, that's when I'm like yelling inside the car and whatever. So I was kind of in that agitated state way more. And again, working homicide, negotiator, all these things. I'm not sleeping well. You're kind of eating like crap sometimes. Like, I had really overtaxed my system, stomped on that gas pedal for far too long. And I think it was leaking oil. And it kind of came to a head. So it was probably, if you had a graph, it's going like this, and eventually now it's up into here. Yeah. And it's now kind of overwhelming my capabilities or my capacity to bring myself back into that window of tolerance. I think I started sailing up along top of it, and now I'm bumping against the roof and over top of that top part of my window of tolerance, staying in that hyper arousal all the time. Not sleeping well, drinking too much, trying to medicate that way. I don't take any medication. Like, I don't barely take cold medication, but for sure I was drinking too much, 2, 3, 4 drinks a day, thinking that's what's going to help me sleep. And of course, that's not going to be the answer for me. So I had no preconceived notions of not wanting to go to therapy. like the ego part of it. However, I'm going to tell a quick story here because I think I have time. Yeah, I've got time. I had to do mandatory wellness evaluations when I was in homicide and child protection and negotiator, etc. As soon as I hear the word mandatory, my back gets up because, again, my contrarian nature says, okay, well, cool, but whatever. So I went to my first session and I'm like, I am going to get out of there in record time. I was on homicide at the time. I'm like, I'm going to see if I can get there in the hour session. I want to be done in 20 minutes. I was done in 21 minutes. I came back like, yeah, I win. Like, I didn't buy into it at all. The guy they sent me to was not effective at all either, which I'll talk about in a minute here. My second one, it's like a year later or whatever it is. And I'm like, I'm going to use my deadly negotiator skills, and he is going to tell me all about himself. I am not telling him shit. Sure enough, I hear about his retirement plans, how much he loves golf, what his wife does, and whatever, half hour, 40 minutes. He tells me all the things. I have shared nothing. I don't think he even asked how I was. So whatever. A year later, I'm like, okay, I'm in child abuse at the time, and I had gone to autopsy of a child. So I had something to talk about, and this sounds maybe a bit odd, but I think police officers and police officer adjacent civilians and probably their families understand this. There's things that bother you that should, and there's things that don't bother you that you think you should. This is one of those instances where I went to the autopsy and it didn't bother me. And then you start to question, well, what the hell's wrong with me? Why did this not bother me? But it didn't. So we'll park that for a sec. So I go to my mandatory wellness, and I tell the story. I'm like, hey, I went to an autopsy of a child. Every time I see a certain thing, I see this. I don't want to trauma slime anybody. And he's like, well, sounds like you're handling it. I'm like, all right, cool. That was it. Like, completely useless. So fast forwarding now to 2021, I have a very good friend who's a psychologist that's attached to Edmonton Police that I dealt with a lot when I was in HR. I tell her about my experience with my mandatory wellness. She blows her top, says that's ridiculous. And then I start to talk about how dysregulated I am at this time. And I don't want to overstate this, and this is how I'll put it. I wasn't suicidal, but I could see it from there. If this is how I was going to be in the next 18 months or 2 years, I don't think I can make it past that. I hadn't got to the point of my family would be better off without me, but I could see that path and it wasn't that far away. So again, talk to my friend, the psychologist. She phones her friend who she thinks very highly of, therapist, and I get into him instantly or right away. And then very intensively, starting in June of 2021, I start going to see this guy. Now, the difference with him is, and I'm going to use the term therapist broadly because he's not a psychologist. He is actually a registered social worker, a master's social worker. And his methodology is very somatic based, so very much body based. Because for me, talk therapy doesn't work. And I'm not disparaging talk therapy because I think it works really well for some people. For me, it doesn't. And if I could see all the folks who are watching here, I could tell you all the stories of what I've seen. You all will feel worse. I will feel no different. It doesn't discharge any of that. So he practices somatic based and specifically EMDR, which I wrote down because I never remember, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. But I'm just going to say EMDR because that's a mouthful. So sometimes it could be where they move their finger and you're moving your eyes. It's a bilateral movement. I don't know the science behind it. But what worked for me is he put almost like a video game paddle in each of my hands, and they're attached to wires. And then he could control the speed and length of a buzzing. So they would alternate buzzing, and they had lights too, but the lights didn't work for me. I didn't like it. The buzzing would just go intermittently, so back and forth, and sometimes this is for a long time or a short time, depending on what we were working on. So we started out kind of chronologically with childhood trauma, and then through policing, and we would then break down these incidents or whatever we're talking about, and then the buzzing, we'd kind of go buzz back and forth. What was interesting that he said about my system was oftentimes his clients would come in and he could set the machine for, oh, Scott wants this, like he just knows it's going to be as far as timing on the buzzing. Mine needed something different every time. So there was you couldn't just set a button. We have to kind of work with what is that frequency going back and forth and how does it work. So reading books like The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate, Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk really gave me a deep understanding of how trauma is stored in our body. And I really felt that the trauma was stored in my body. So again, talking about it and trying to process it with this wasn't working. I had to process it with metabolizing it out of my system. And metabolizing is from My Grandmother's Hands, Resma Menachem, a fantastic book as well, highly recommended. And I had to metabolize it through. So that's what worked for me. 2 other lessons I learned in therapy in particular, self-compassion. My inner voice was not kind. It was very, you're useless, you're slow, you're fat, you're dumb, you're blah, blah, blah. And I think oftentimes when I do these presentations, especially when I can see everybody, I see lots of people nodding along that, yeah, that's my inner voice as well. I didn't have one saying, you're doing really good, I'm proud of you, etc. This one mostly is quieted down. This one is a little bit better than it was, but it's still kind of not there. That's still something I'm working on. The other part of it too is when I am dysregulated, the why doesn't matter. Oh, there's a question just popped up there. So the why am I dysregulated doesn't make any difference. It's the body is telling the truth. The mind is trying to tell a story in my my system. So just noticing that I'm going through that, and I'm going to park it there because I have another story to tell about. I have not got this all figured out, and I'm super regulated because I'll tell a story. But I want to get back and do another breath technique with us, so I don't run out of time for that. Perfect. So this next one is going to be some of the principles that I want to make sure that we leave with. So if you can go blah, 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 Scott, whatever he said, the key takeaways for me, I think, is being aware of your breath, breathing in and out of your nose as much as possible. There's science behind it, which we don't have time to go into right now. And if you're in an agitated state, making your exhale longer than your inhale. Like those are kind of the 3: awareness, nose breath, longer exhales. And that will have won the game for us today. So what I'll do is I'll take us through that little brief centering again, and then I'm going to cue us to making our inhale a little bit longer than our usual one, and then making the exhale longer than that. And I'll use a term or the numbers, inhaling to a count of 4, exhaling to a count of 5. But if those numbers don't resonate or that doesn't feel safe, again, just making that inhale a bit longer than your usual and making the exhale longer than that. So I'd invite you to get comfortable again in wherever you're seated. Again, just noticing your back body against the chair. Noticing your feet on the floor. And then again, with almost no effort, just noticing your breath. No need to change or alter it yet. Maybe notice that movement of your breath in your nose or your chest or your abdomen. And there's no right or wrong or good or bad. It's just noticing. And the next inhale, we're going to inhale to a count of about 4. And then the exhale, we're going to draw out to a count of about 5. And again, if those numbers don't resonate, just making that inhale a little bit longer than our usual and making the exhale longer than that. And maintaining that little bit longer in and a little bit longer out. Just drawing our awareness and our attention to the area above our brow. So it's almost right in the middle of our forehead. Oftentimes we hold tension or stress or strain there. And then moving our awareness down to our eyes. And if our eyes are closed, noticing the not quite darkness behind our eyes. If our eyes are open, just noticing the wide, soft gaze. And checking back in with the breath and just seeing if we've maintained that little bit longer in, a little bit longer out. And if not, just, again, gently nudging ourselves back in that direction. And allowing our breath to come back to its regular rate. Just checking in with ourselves and see how do we feel in all ways. So how do we feel physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally? And again, approaching that with curiosity and kindness and compassion, not with any frustration or judgment. And if your eyes were closed, just allowing them gently to flutter open. And take in any movements you need, stretches. tapping. Good. Okay, so going through therapy, very hard work at the start, very difficult, very intensive as far as the number and frequency I was going. And then gradually over the last couple of years, it slowed from like once a week for 2 hours to once every 2 weeks, so once a month, and it's trickled down, and it was what I needed at the time. I want to talk a little bit because this is all fresh and new. So this is a part of, and this is not a presentation I ever write out. I have some bullet points here, and it pretty much is different every time I talk. But recently retiring, so I knew in 2021 when I was in that dysregulated state that I can't retire like this. Like I had the idea that I was going to be kind of leaving back then, but I'm like, my wife and boys and my family doesn't need to be dealing with me in this dysregulated state. So that was kind of the impetus for going to therapy. And my brother retired back at that same time. I think he's been done 18 months now. And he had not done this work. So I'm a little bit further in the track of being regulated. He left policing and then was dysregulated. And again, I'm watching my father leave. So I think the key point, another key message, I guess, and I don't want to give advice, but if retirement is in the next even 5 years, I think really starting to put your mind into the, how do I make sure that I'm leaving as well as I can be? Like we all get tested physically, psychologically, mentally, etc., to get on in policing. And then no one really gives a shit when you're leaving about how you are feeling, or no one's testing you to go, how are you? Well, you just leave and like a hand out of a bucket of water, and kind of reconciling that. Like it's a unique process, and people have asked, this is very fresh. And people ask how it's been. It is 100% the right decision. I love my career. I wouldn't change a thing. It exceeded all my expectations, but I don't want to do it anymore. But part of that was not identifying with, I think the advantage of being a senior officer, and we have white shirts, so being a white shirt was I was already kind of had drifted away from the mission of why I was a police officer in the first place. I wasn't even vaguely operational anymore. I had been a critical incident commander. I forgot to mention that, but that had ended in 2021 as well. So right around that time. So I was kind of had moved away. So I think that made the transition a bit easier, but it's still been an interesting process with, I've said it, it's like there's a pot on the stove and it's kind of bubbling away. It's not boiling. And the emotions are like happy, sad, glad, afraid, and just kind of a constant. And it's not super intense, but it's a low grade, interesting process. And the other part of it is when I was very dysregulated, like I said, I would be mad, sad, crying, bawling for no apparent reason. The last little while has been a really interesting process with, I'm quite emotional, but not, it doesn't feel bad and it's not bad. Like I've discovered Zach Bryan this summer. I don't know where this kid came from, but he's a friggin' poet, because his, and I've cried 40 times. Like Terry's like, my wife's be like, you're crying again? I'm like, I don't know. There's a couple lines in here that I can't even sing or say, or else I'm going to start crying. Yeah. It's been remarkable. I was in Whistler this past week. A friend of mine was doing that 29029 where she's climbing up and down Whistler Mountain 7 or 8 times. Right on. And it was beautiful. And then I was volunteering with this absolute angel of a man. He's about 65-year-old dude. And he probably made me almost cry 15 times because he was so great with all the participants. But it's an emotionality that I think as police officers, and particularly as men, we tamp down. Right. Part of therapy for me was, and the analogy, and I'm very visual, and I was very visual while I was doing it, is I call it my trauma trunk. So I think all of us have a trauma trunk that we bury at the bottom of the ocean, and then we put all of the awful things that we've seen into that trauma trunk, throw locks on it, and assume it's good. It's at the ocean, bottom of the ocean, it's never coming back up. Yeah. And I don't want to give spoiler alert, it's coming back up. Like when I talk about my dad and his friends crying about a collision that happened 35 years ago, the rust had taken over the locks and the trauma trunk popped up. And I actually in the EMDR would work specifically, I could see the trauma trunk buried in the ocean, and we would take things out of it and we would put things back into it. And that's how I kind of emptied it out, where it got to the point for me. And again, this is a very personal experience. This is not necessarily everybody else's experience, where I could look in the trauma trunk and there was nothing floating to the surface anymore. It still exists, but it's largely empty now. And I'm not getting suddenly flooded with a scene from whatever 2007 and homicide or what have you. and I've metabolized a lot of those through.
Yeah.
And if you're,
I was going to say, and I'm so appreciative of you. You're just so open and sharing, and I think it's amazing. So thank you so much, because if you're somebody who's retired and, you know, all of these feelings are bubbling up, this trauma is bubbling up, and you don't know to anticipate that that's what happens, and you're not connected with anybody, you're not talking to anybody about this, you can really kind of turn that inward in a negative way, in a shameful way, thinking, you know, that maybe there's something wrong, when in fact, you know, it's such a common occurrence for, you know, people that do trauma exposed work, you know.
and you don't, when you're kind of in it, or when I was in it, it was, you can't see the forest for the trees, using that cliche. And it's all good to say, well, you're not alone. Well, I felt alone, and I have tremendous support. Like, my wife and I have been together forever, and I have my brother and I are close, and I have very close friends that I can lean on. But I wasn't able to utilize them because I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what question to ask. So I didn't know where to start. And again, I had been doing, that's why I was so frustrated with myself, is I'm doing all the things that I thought I was supposed to be doing. I'm trying all these different modalities that I seem to be working. One that I haven't talked about yet is Indigenous spirituality, and specifically Cree culture, where I've done a number of sweats, which made a huge difference in my system. And my very first sweat, I don't have panic attacks. I had like an 8.5 out of 10 panic attack in the sweat, because it is very dark, it is very hot, it is very claustrophobic. And I managed to get through, and there was 4 rounds in this particular way. And the second round, and then the tent opens, or the sweat lodge opens, and then you can get water, blah, 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 go through the second one. And the elder, when he explained it, is round 1 signifies when you are a baby to a young child. And these are my words, I'm totally paraphrasing here. Round 2 was young adult. Round 3 was older adult. Round 4 was old one. So I'm like, well, all the trauma in my system that I've experienced was from in round 1 and round 2. Like, I'm now currently in round 3. So once he said that, round 3 and 4, and every sweat I've done since, and I think I've done 7 or 8, not even close to any of that stuff. So it was just another very unique, and I was so fortunate to get to have this opportunity. I'm going to do another one in November. It was just a different way of thinking. And I think that's one other thing, again, not to give advice, but having like a open mind, or a growth mindset, or whatever terminology, to all of these things. My kids are in their 20s, and they got into climbing. Like, there's a bouldering thing. So you're not strapped in, you just kind of climb up, whatever, 15 feet. It's hard to stay in a dysregulated or agitated state when you go climbing, because you have to think, and it's bilateral movement. So our bodies, again, like using both sides. It's just scary enough that you have to pay attention. And I've gone right from work where I'm kind of agitated, and I've climbed, and I felt better. And again, back to the teaching, what I need to learn, about, I don't know, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, I was at an award ceremony. I was getting an award. I didn't want the award, whatever. But my nervous system saw that award ceremony as tremendous danger. So I was extremely dysregulated that day. Went to this ceremony, did my thing, got my medal. Then I went, met my brother, felt a little bit better, came home, and again, significantly dysregulated. I was an ass to my wife, which I never am. I had an auditory exclusion where she's talking to me and I couldn't really even hear, and I'm eating food and I can't really taste. Like, I'm in a huge sympathetic nervous system state. All doesn't feel very good. The positive to all that is it lasted that day. The next day I felt hungover, and I hadn't been drinking, but I felt worn out and hungover. And the next day after that, looking back, it was like a storm had come through and knocked all the trees and branches and put puddles all over. And I was like, huh. So the good part of all that is, and not to use the term good or bad, but in 2021, that lasted months. In this particular incident, this lasted a day tops, and then it was done. And I knew what was happening. And again, I was teaching breath work, all that. I couldn't find my breath. So if you're like, and then maybe some folks sitting there right now, like, I'm really agitated, your breath work is pissing me off and it's not working for me. That's all good. There's no good or bad or right or wrong to it. It's just maybe in a few moments, you can, again, just start to pay attention to your feet on the floor, And if the only thing you do is make that exhale a bit longer or breathe through your nose instead of your mouth, that's winning the game. And then just doing that hundreds and thousands of times relentlessly over the next little while, I promise is going to make a difference in your nervous system as one single modality, because there's all of these different things. And talking about therapists, which I alluded to, mandatory wellness guy, terrible at his job. Shouldn't have been, he was retiring and he should have already retired. He was terrible at his job. The guy I had, awesome. But him and I have had significant arguments where we have sworn at each other. Well, I swore at him, he didn't swear at me. Where I didn't, some of the things he was saying, I didn't like, and I challenged him on it. He took it like a champ, but there has to be that reciprocity and back and forth between that. And if you're going to a therapist and after 5 or 6 sessions, you're like, I don't like this lady or I don't like this guy, probably find someone new, because it has to be somebody you like. Otherwise, you're wasting your time, money, etc. And it's not actually probably going to help your nervous system regulate.
And you got to be a contrarian in your therapy successfully, right?
Always got to be the contrarian.
You know?
Yeah.
But you do have to be able to be your authentic self, and if you don't feel safe, it's not the right connection for you,
Yep, 100%. And I was being my authentic self on the mandatory one, but I was kind of being a jerk where I was just playing toy. I was like a cat playing with yarn. That's all that was. And he wasn't engaged, so he kind of played into what I was doing, so it was no big deal.
Yeah.
I just wanted to invite any of our guests that have joined us today. If you have any questions that you want to ask Scott, please take this opportunity to write them into the chat, and Louise and I will provide those to Scott for his answering. Scott, just to kick us off with the first question, one of our viewers today is asking if you can provide the list of books that you've talked about throughout today. Just if we can maybe grab those from you.
Yeah, I'll email you, Jen or Louise, and I'll kind of have a resource list there. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And so we can provide those out to all the those that viewed today. So you have a list of that. What would you say would be your number one sort of go-to book if people were just kind of getting interested now? Where would you start?
Breath by James Nestor.
Okay, Breath by James Nestor.
He should give me royalties, because I've touted his book in more venues. And I actually, when I was as a superintendent, I bought like 6 of them in my workspace and had people could sign them out. That would be my number one go-to book, because it's so accessible, and it really is actually life-changing when you see the science behind all that. I actually had a conversation on the mountain in Whistler, and this lady was having trouble. She's like, I can't get my heart rate down. So I went over and like, hey, you want to try a longer exhale? Exactly what I did with you folks. And she did it. And then I had 2 or 3 other people coming over like, hey, what is that? And then they were talking about the book Breath. So it's science and math, and it's not anything special beyond that. It's just kind of being aware and bring yourself to it.
That's awesome.
We've had a couple of suggested books put into the Q&A here. So by Gabor is Mate, The Myth of Normal and When the Body Says No. Those have been helpful to one of the participants.
Yeah, I agree. Both are really, really good. Yep. Gabor Mate is a star. He appears on all kinds of podcasts. Andrew Huberman, and kind of sometimes it comes down to a bandwidth thing. Like I nerd out on this stuff, and my wife does as well, because we started a little yoga company online version, and I'm happy to put that in there. And the thing with our company is we have a sliding scale to make sure that it's accessible, so people can pay $0 or $5 or $10, whatever. We're not doing a lot of live classes yet. We'll open that up, but there's a library of probably 60 or 70 videos in there. And if anybody wants, and I'll put that in the resources. Wonderful. And then my brother and I have a podcast where we talk about all this stuff all the time. And we have we're actually doing one this afternoon with remarkable guests from all walks of life. And it's called Just Us on Justice and Other Things. So it has to do with the justice system, but kind of the other things gives us an out that we have conversations with folks that are outside that. But we've had folks who
I listen regularly, and I would encourage everybody to check it out for sure. It's awesome. You and Dan do a fantastic job, and you've had wonderful, really, really interesting guests on your show. So well done. Well
Thank you so
done.
much. And we started out with like, we'll try 50 episodes,
Yeah.
and then if it's not doing it, we'll kill it. I think we're at 55 now, and
Yeah.
I have a list of probably 30 people that I need to get on there because I'm going to run out of time and space. We'll just keep doing it.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. One of our viewers today just wanted to share some thanks for sharing your personal journey about trauma and the manner that you're addressing your recovery, just letting you know that you're a true inspiration. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. I have a question for you, Scott. Just you're 6'1", you're a big dude, you took yourself into the yoga class. Like, any advice? That could be a very uncomfortable experience, right? Any advice for people that are just uncomfortable even going down the pathway?
I think, and there is a tremendous vulnerability to go into those spaces. And it seems to be there's a higher vulnerability for men because it is a female dominated space. Yeah. Oftentimes I'm the only one in there. And one of the things, because you say the word yoga and everyone will have a different idea what that is. And oftentimes it's like a 20-something white lady who can do back bends. And you're like, well, I can't do that. So that's not me. So I think how I've kind of broken those barriers down is people look at me and go, well, if that brontosaurus can do it, it can't be that hard. But I think recognizing that in a yoga space, when you put your mat down, it seems like everyone cares what everybody else is doing. I promise you, no one cares at all what anybody else is doing. But just like a therapist, finding the right modality of yoga, finding the right teacher is key. And I'll put my contact information here on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. And if someone has questions, I'm more than happy to answer any of those questions or have a conversation like this. I had a couple dudes came to me and they're like, I want to come to yoga, but I don't want to look stupid and I'm not good at it and all the things. So I pull them aside. We did a one-on-one session where I just did some of the verbiage. Like, this is what Warrior 1 looks like. Here's where you put your feet. This is Warrior 2. This is some of the child's pose. And when those words are said, and I'm like, if you don't know what to do, that's the teacher's fault, not your fault. So recognizing that this is all new. So the instructor has to make it so that every person in the room gets something out of it. And that's from beginner to seasoned veteran. And I'm lucky that I have that wide range. I have a wide range of diverse folks who come because of the space that's been created, not just by me, but by kind of the community that's in that room. My wife and I just did a retreat. We do retreats, day retreats, like for 6 to 8 hours. And we'll do yoga, breath work, hot and cold, and the science behind all that stuff, a mindful walk. And again, we had last one, a judge and 3 Crown prosecutors who all knew each other but didn't know they were coming to that particular retreat. So we kind of try to make it accessible because sometimes it gets a little woo-woo and people are like, I don't want to hear about chakras. I want to know why I can't stop crying, right? So how do I use a breath technique so that I can regulate myself? So we don't really kind of go into the chakra stuff. We're kind of more, and my wife is an OT by trade, so it's more practical movement. And I can tell you, if you go to yoga and find the right instructor, and it could be online with us or Do Yoga With Me is another great site. Heart and Bones is another great site, and I'll put all those in the notes after. And finding an online version maybe to start where you're like, I don't want to go into a studio until I'm more comfortable. Well, doing it in your living room, and COVID really kind of tested that where you could do it on your own and figure it out that way.
Yeah. So people can, someone's asked if they're able to join virtually and participate in your yoga sessions.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So right now it's videos, and I will likely, starting in November, I was doing Sundays at 9 a.m. my time. So it'll be 11 a.m. your time. And if people want to do it live, if you just go into, and I'll put it on there, Twisted Yoga and Wellness, put your email in there. And then again, you can access the videos. I don't care if people pay. I got to emphasize that it makes no difference to me. And some people get their backs up. I'm like, then pay for the class. I don't care. It's not how I feed myself. So it's just, I want to make sure it's accessible for folks. But yes, I'll put that on there too.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Before we close, I don't know if there's more questions. I want to do one more breath technique. So I just want to park that. We'll take it. We're good?
We're good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this one is called a physiological sigh. And it's, again, really accessible. Andrew Huberman, who's a neuro something or other in Stanford, does a great job of explaining, but really it kind of gives your system a reset. And it's, we're going to inhale in our nose and then inhale again. So it's a, and then an exhale, and I'll coach us through it here right away. And it kind of expands the lower part of your lungs, because the top part of our lungs are innervated into our sympathetic nervous system. The bottom part of our lungs are innervated into our parasympathetic system. So again, it accesses that lower part of our lung lobes. And again, it could be sitting in front of the screen and an email, which tells your system that there's a tiger there and you get that agitated. Sitting there and doing this breath technique can kind of reset your system in very, very short order. So what I'll do is we'll exhale together, and then I'll coach us through an inhale, and then the full exhale. Inhales in the nose, and this is one of the times we're going to exhale out of our mouth. And we'll do that. Let's do that 3 times.
Okay.
So if we all kind of just sitting comfortably, sitting tall, and then everyone exhaling together. And then inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for your attention. It was very nice seeing you, Louise, and Jen's face. It's way better to talk to people, and it's tough on a screen. I like doing this in person way more, but I'll send you that list of resources, and it was an honor for me to be here.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really, really appreciate having you here. Applause floating up there for you. So thank you.
That's lovely. And hearts.
Thank you.
It's nice.
Thank you. All right. That's it. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to be here. I loved how this was educational and experiential, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well. So thank you. Thanks again.
So much. Take care.